Hello again, and welcome back to episode 2, chapter 2 of our Dig Down Deep series, exploring the book of Ruth as we look at her journey from bitterness to hopefulness. Read with me in chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered the field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, episode 2 begins with a series of apparent coincidences. Ruth goes out to pick up the leftover grain to sustain herself and Naomi. Now, as it just happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Now, as we already saw in episode 1, Boaz is a pillar of the community, who also just happens to be related to the clan of Elimelech, to Naomi's dead husband. Now, Catherine M. Schifferdecker, an Old Testament professor, reminds us of the old saying which goes as follows: "A coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous." In the book of Ruth, God does not speak from burning bushes, nor does God divide the sea. Instead, God acts through circumstance and through the faithfulness of ordinary human beings. Now, sometimes we, like Ruth, find ourselves in difficult circumstances, and in these our instinct can be to shut down and withdraw. Ruth, however, shows us a different way. Instead of doing that, she takes action and does something practical. This reminds you of Daniel's advice in Daniel 11, verse 32. He says, "Those who know their God will stand firm and take action." You see, her firm belief in God and her trust in God helps her to simply do the next thing in front of her. Now, this is good advice in trying to discern God's will for our lives. Often, it involves taking the next practical step in front of us and trusting that God will provide. So Ruth does that, and it reminds me so much of what's been happening during communities during this time of lockdown. Ruth reaches out to the community around her for support, and the community responds in a way that provides for both her and Naomi. The process by which she does this is as old as the hills and is known as gleaning. Now, gleaning is the Old Testament process whereby the poor were given access to food and provision. The fields during harvest were not completely cleaned out, but some was left behind for the poor to go and get themselves their daily food. Now, early agricultural laws of the Hebrews supported this common practice, and it was set up by God to support those who had little or no means of providing for themselves. They were often the widows, the elderly who had lost their husbands or relatives due to death or abandonment, and they had no other way to survive. Or perhaps those who, for economic reasons, had to leave their country and go and live somewhere else. In Leviticus, it says specifically, "When you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap the corners of your field or gather the gleanings. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners. I am God, your God." And it wasn't only done with grain, but with a range of different agricultural products, from fruit to olives and other types of crops as well. Whatever was left after the first harvest was for the poor and those in trouble to collect. Now, this practice demonstrated the heart of God, the generosity of God, and his desire that everyone would be cared for. However, this ancient farming practice in modern terms has been considered wasteful, and it's now replaced by modern farming methods, which ensures that everything is collected and nothing is left behind. In this process, Ruth raises an uncomfortable truth that we have become far more self-centered and individualistic in our outlook. Instead of looking out for others, the poor, the widow, the stranger, and immigrants, we are more concerned with our own needs and maximizing efficiency. As a foreigner, even from Moab, she was entitled to take advantage of their hospitality. The heart of God through this is for us to be a generous people, generous with our time and with our resources. Note too that this verse from Leviticus, which explains gleaning, reminds us of the basis upon which we can have this generous heart, that God is our God and will be our God. Because God has been infinitely generous to others, we too in turn can be generous and compassionate to others. You see, we can never outgive God. Either there is no end to his generosity into our lives, so we can keep on giving, knowing that he will supply us according to our need. During lockdown, we have begun to discover again the value of community and reaching out to those in need. As things begin to settle down, let us not draw back into our individualistic and self-centered lives. But as a people who've encountered the overwhelming generosity of God, let us show the way to the lost, the poor, the lonely, the bereaved, and the strangers. Now, this message is particularly relevant in light of the recent death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. This following is an extract of a letter which you can read for yourselves on the TVC Church website. This incident has brought to public attention the vast scale of personal and institutional racism that continues to cause pain and suffering for many people across the world. Even now in the 21st century, as a church family, we have the opportunity to examine our own attitudes and beliefs and to repent of anything that does not please our Heavenly Father. And we have the responsibility to pray for and to reach out and to support any who might be suffering distress at this time. And of course, that responsibility extends outside our church family to all who are in need of support or protection at this time. We have both the opportunity and responsibility to speak out against the injustice of racism wherever it is manifested. And this is the example that Ruth sets us. Here we see the heart of God through this Old Testament practice of gleaning to provide for all of those in community. No one is to be left out and to be excluded. And as we combat racism, as we acknowledge and recognize the mistakes that we have made in the past, we would do well to apply the compassion and generosity that is found here in Ruth. Now, returning to the theme of gleaning, this is a message not just for our local communities, but for our nation and the world around us. Modern capitalism, with all its efficiency and maximizing profits, has left many people destitute and living in poverty and despair. Perhaps some of us might even be inspired to join a modern movement for 21st century gleaning. Watch this short video which explains more.
I regularly meet farmers who currently waste 20, 30, 40, even sometimes 100% of their entire harvest.
From my experience, when I used to supply the supermarkets, you generally grew about a third more than you thought you would sell, just to make sure that, you know, the supermarket buyer didn't have a tantrum when you ran short. And so routinely you have more than you can sell and you just mow it off and plough it in. That's the normal thing to do.
We picked the beans, but after we brought about 2 tons here, all the companies rejected. They rotted. Just imagine when the order is cancelled at the last moment. As a human being, how do you feel?
This one is a reject, which is curved because it's not straight like this one.
This one is imperfect, but it's pigeon pecked around the outside and it's discoloured a bit here and there, but the heart is perfectly good.
But you can't sell it.
But I can't sell it.
It's an odd apple, but odd apples are okay because they're odd looking, but they're very tasty still.
Who's that man arresting in the bar? Who's that man again? Who's that man?
If you'd like to know more about modern gleaning, you can follow that link to find out more about how you can be involved in this practice. So as we end this episode 2, we come to understand that God uses the kindness of strangers to reveal his generosity to Ruth, as she discovers deeper depths to the hope that God provides. However, God has even more for her. Verse 3 draws to our attention that this isn't just any field that she turns up to. This is the field of Boaz. Coincidence or God incidence? Join us shortly for episode 3 to find out more.